السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. بسم الله. Thank you all very much for coming out. It's really been an honor to have this time to come and talk to communities in different parts of the United States about the advent of this text, Study Quran, and how it came about. And this is the second time that I've been to Houston, and I have to say that of all of the communities of Muslims in the United States that I go to, I'm most impressed with the Houston community, and so I'm also most intimidated because I know that there are many scholars out here who know many aspects of the Quran far better than do I, and probably better than I ever will. And so it's both it's an honor to be here, and it's also very humbling to be here as well. Now, what I want to do is begin by talking about how the Study Quran came about and why we actually did this text. Because this is one of the things that is also often misunderstood about the Study Quran, is that usually when you write an academic book, you go out and the process is that one puts together a book, has a research idea, and then as one gets near completion, one starts proposing the book idea to different publishers in different places for different reasons. And then one eventually finds a publisher that's willing to lose money on publishing your book, and you get it out there, and it is, as one person said regarding academic books, it is skimmed by literally dozens and dozens of academics. But in this case, the way in which the book came about was far different. That, in fact, HarperCollins had the idea to do a Study Quran. Now, who here has ever taken a look at a study Bible? All right, so you've got, a few people have experienced the phenomena of the study Bible. This is a widespread genre of text, particularly in the United States, where now you've got several evangelical movements that have their own study Bibles, and you've got a Jewish study Bible, a Catholic study Bible, an Orthodox study Bible. So it's become a way in which the Bible is often encountered for people who want to go more deeply into the text within the American context in particular. But nobody has ever done this for the Quran in a Western language. So HarperCollins had the idea that they would like to do a study Quran. They contacted Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Now, Sayyid Hussein Nasr is not himself a person whom you would identify as a scholar of the Quran, and in fact, for that reason, he wanted to put the text down. He didn't want to take on the task of preparing a study Quran. And then he thought about it, and he came to realize that, well, this was something that whatever decision he made regarding this was going to be something that he would have to answer for on the Day of Judgment. And when it comes to the Quran, many of us in the Muslim community are somewhat shielded from a lot of the misrepresentations and disrepresentations. Disrepresentation being an intentional way in which one is doing it, and a misrepresentation might not always be intentional. But all of these misrepresentations and disrepresentations of the Quran that are out there, and there are many actually, I would say, within the Western Academy itself. So he realized that this was, in a sense, on one hand, it was an opportunity. On the other hand, you don't know who's going to go, who HarperCollins might go to and do this if Muslims don't do it. Who are they going to take it to next? Are they going to take it to revisionist scholars? Are they going to take it to people who have just only a Western historical critical view of the Quran and aren't interested in exploring some of its theological implications? There are, within the Western Academy, scholars of the Quran who really, if you go deeply into it and you read all of their writings, they're Christian triumphalists. And that possibility existed as well. And if these are one of the groups to whom the project of the Study Quran was then proposed, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr had put it down, his feeling was that he would then be responsible for it. So in this sense, he felt that it was a fard kifaya, that it was an obligation that somebody within the Muslim community had to do, and they had approached him first. And also the way that it works with publishing houses, you can't just go and say, well, no, go to him instead. That doesn't mean that that's what they're going to do. So he took on this task, and the first person that he asked to join the editorial team was myself, and then we we put together, had other people join the editorial team after that. And I was a little bit more arrogant. I was excited about doing it. Didn't quite fully realize, in a sense, the burden that we were taking on. And if I had, I might not have done it. Because, I mean, really, this was, I've told people that the process of doing the study Quran made my dissertation look like a minor term paper. Which you know, I can't really imagine doing another project quite this large and engaging. One of the reasons why doing this project became so encompassing is that when we went through all of the English translations of the Quran that are out there, we realized that none of these translations was really going to work for a study text. Now, one of the reasons is that if you look, for example, and there are some very good translations that I really have benefited from tremendously, but there are three principles that we're looking for in translation. The first principle is accuracy. This basically being true to what is, you know, the linguistic meaning of the text. And the second principle would be consistency. Now, there are people in this audience who are far more familiar with the Quran than I am myself, but anybody who reads the Quran regularly knows that it is these kind of ways in which patterns are repeated, even sound patterns are repeated, but words are repeated, roots are repeated, that suddenly, even after 20 years of reading the Quran daily, all of a sudden, you make a connection. And you make it because of the way in which, like, for example, the same divine names might come at the end of a particular passage and another passage. This is actually something that Fakhruddin Razi does in his commentary, that he often says that the way in which the divine names are used exposes the relationships between different surahs. And then, of course, words at their root, if they're translated completely differently, then you're not going to see the relationship between passages when you're reading. So this was our second principle, consistency. And then there's also eloquence. One of the issues that we tend to have is that we've got over 80 translations of the Quran into English. I haven't counted them myself, this is what I've been told. 80 translations. Now, one of the reasons is we keep on having new translations now, because people say, well, it has to be a language that people can understand today. I teach in the Arab world, and there are many native speakers of Arabic here who know this better than do I. The Quran is a unique book in all of world literature in that it is a genre unto itself. There is nothing like it in Arabic. It echoes aspects of pre-Islamic poetry, and then the whole tradition after it echoes aspects of the Quran. But there is nothing like this where you hear Quran, and even Christian Arabs, even Christian Arab scholars will say, no, there's nothing like the Quran. That there's nothing like this in the Arabic language. And they even recognize, I'd say the intonation of the divine within that language. So how do you capture that in English? Putting it into the modern idiom would be almost like translating the Quran from Quranic Arabic into modern Fusha. And these are really very different languages. And even a person who knows Fusha and reads the newspaper every day in Arabic and hasn't read the Quran, they pick up the Quran, it's not going to be something that's easy for them. So people will often say, well, this aspect of English might be somewhat difficult for me, and this, that, and the other thing. Well, actually, the Quran is a text, the very language of it demands your attention. It says you have to focus, put aside other things, focus upon this. And so we felt that something that captures that resonance within the English language would be the best register into which to put the Quran. So this is really something that has the resonance of what we call technically early modern English. For the layperson, that's Shakespeare, King James English. And one of the things I actually did in the course of this project was to go through and ask people repeatedly, what sounds like the word of God to you in English? And 85% of the time or more, people would say Shakespeare or King James. So there's also actually a study of this. It says that of native speakers of English who read the Bible regularly, more than 40% read the King James regularly. The next highest percentage is the NIV translation, which comes in at 19%. That should be very telling to us. And so if you want to communicate to non-Muslims, you might say the majesty of Quranic Arabic, you're never going to do it full justice in translation. But to communicate it, you need something that hits that register, that has that, you might say, echo of timelessness that certain modes of literature and modes of expression within English have achieved over time. There's also a very interesting phenomena that one can liken the King James Bible to the Quran in terms of the history that each text has had in its language. The King James Bible has completely refashioned the English language and all of English literature. No book is more influential. No book is more influential in Arabic literature than the Quran. This is obviously not a one-to-one correspondence, but it helps. And so this is why we chose a language which is not fully early modern English, but echoes it in many ways. And so these were our three principles. Now, we didn't find a translation that really met these. For example, you go into A.J. Arbery, which is the one that I would always recommend to people before, but there are places where A.J. Arbery actually makes some grammatical mistakes. And then there are also places where it's inconsistent in how recurring phrases within the Quran are rendered. Same with Pickthall, very inconsistent in how recurring phrases are rendered. And then other ones that are in more of the modern idiom. So we felt we had to do a new translation. That added 3 years onto the project. And even now, I go back to this translation and I look and there are things that say, we could have gotten that, because I think that, for example, word order in the Quran is extremely important. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does it says almost the exact same thing in one place, and you've got the maf'ul bihi, or the direct object, coming after the verb, but then in another place it says the same thing and you have the direct object coming before the verb, there is a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did that. And usually you won't find a translation catching those nuances. We tried to catch them, but we didn't always. And I even go back now and I go, oh, man, we could have just changed that around a little bit, and it would have matched the word order a little bit better. So these are some of the principles that we were looking for, and we hope that we've achieved a text that is better for study and for, in a sense, bringing to the outside reader who's maybe knows some Arabic but can't really read it regularly, or to the non-Muslim who doesn't know any of it, never experiences it, to really be able to experience something of the majesty of the text in some way. Now, then the next part was how we go about the commentary. All right, this was, and this, for those of you who don't know the project, this is the meat of the study Quran, in my humble opinion. Is that, now am I messing up your video by going back and forth here? All right, because I like to pace when I talk. I don't get enough exercise. So, no. All right, so this is really the meat of the project, is the commentary. There are about 1 million words of commentary in the text, which makes it about 5.5 words of commentary for every word of translation. Now, how we did this is we went in, and there was a lot of discussion as to, should we make certain tafsir, that's commentaries, the ones that we must go to in all instances, and should we make certain principles of exegesis, ones that we have to cover within each one. And we realized that actually that's not necessarily the way to do it. And so we really allowed for each of the scholars who was doing the research, and the people who wrote the commentary are myself, Maria Deke, Janer Dale, and Muhammad Rostam. And then Sayyid Hussein Nasser, as the editor-in-chief, he went over everything, he helped us coordinate certain passages, but we also would go in and we all edited everybody else's passages. So we tried to make sure, one of this is to make sure that we are not repeating what has been said in one place, and so we have a whole full discussion of the root meaning of fasad in two different places, try to avoid repetitions like that in different ways, and also call each other out on what might be our own kind of peculiarities and predilections that we end up reading into the commentary. And this is something that helped to achieve a single voice, you might say. Nonetheless, there are differences in how some of us approached it. So I can really speak for myself, mostly in terms of this, which is that I would go, one of the things I always wanted to look at was the different qira'at, or the different recitations of the Quran, and then go in, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that there are 7 different schools of recitation that are considered mutawatir. That is, in a sense, we can almost say with certainty that these are ways in which the Quran was recited by the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. And then there are 3 more that are mashhur, or well known. And this was a process that the Islamic tradition came to, where in the 4th century got out some of were some of the other ways of reciting that were not, in a sense, verified by tradition. But anyway, so when there were instances where you would actually have a different implication for the meaning of the text from one of the other schools of recitation, we try to incorporate that in the commentary. And another thing is to try to incorporate all of the, well, not all of, but to take into account all of the occasions of revelation. And by the way, there's a very important point here, which is that as kind of thinking of the Quran in an insular way within our community, we tend to use this term occasions of revelation. But really, occasions of revelation is historical contexts. And it's one of the things that we've actually tried to do with the whole of the study Quran, is to show that when it comes to the notion of a historical critical method for evaluating the text, it's there. It's in the Islamic tradition. And in fact, it's one of the most featured aspects of the tafsir tradition is what are some of the different historical contexts or asbab an-nuzul that are given for one verse, and what might different meanings of this verse be given some of these different interpretations of what these are. And then there are some verses of the Quran that really you can't fully understand how to act in accord with them without understanding the particular historical context of that exact verse. So we try to employ this within the commentary, and then that, for me, at least in the sections for which I was responsible, which was the commentary on Surah Al-Fatiha, and then Surah Al-Ankabut, Surah 29, the spider, through to the end, Surah Al-Nas, Surah 114. I tried to then also go into what are known as the Ummahat tafsir, which would be things like Tabari, Qurtubi, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Baydawi, and Jalalain, and these are some of the main ones that one would go to. But oftentimes, when one goes to these commentaries that are considered kind of the root of the tradition, one's going to find that they don't always address things that might be important to us within a verse today. And then there are also verses that, it's interesting, you look at the accumulation of tradition over time, that sometimes there would just get to be that, well, we pass over a particular, not much is said about a particular verse at times, and it almost comes to be how people are writing tafsirs, because they're all in dialogue with one another. And you have to kind of go and find a particular tafsir that might be into that. Also, when it comes to issues, for example, a text that has legal matters, something, books on ahkam and Quran, that is the ahkam or the edicts, the rulings that are within the Quran are going to be more important. And then when it comes to issues that have to do with tarbiyah, or the training of the soul, the purification of the self, sometimes there are going to be Sufi commentaries that are more useful for this. Another issue that we wanted to get into is when there were major disagreements within the tradition over time, such as free will, predestination, or the issue of qadr. We wanted to represent what the different opinions were over time, and when there are verses that are particularly important for a particular school of thought in Islamic history, one that has been prominent, such as Shiite theology, we would go to a Shiite commentary and put that in as one of the ways in which a particular verse has been interpreted. Now, one of the things that should become clear when I'm talking about how this is done is that this is not in a sense, it's not like most tafsir that are written, because tafsir are almost always written by an individual within a particular school of classical Islam representing that school. So, one person asked, we've been accused of digressing from the Sunni creed. Well, we didn't actually even try to stay within the Sunni creed. We tried to show places where there are, these are some fundamentally important verses for aspects of Ash'ari creed or Maturidi theology, but also these are some fundamentally importance for the Shiite understandings. When it comes to the Shiite understanding that the Quran is not uncreated, that we've gotten into that. And when it comes to, for example, the arguments that you also have of the Mu'tazilates, that the Quran is uncreated, which is still a school, the view that exists among Ibadi Muslims. We've been, in a sense, honest about that. So we've tried to be honest that there is not one monolithic view regarding these particular verses over time. This is the way in which it's been, in which we hope that we've accomplished something, that when one picks up this text, one can look at this, and then really anybody who comes and says, the problem with Muslims is that they view the Quran as monolithic. And this is a constant refrain that you actually see. People will say, well, you can't talk with Muslims because, they think that the Quran is the word of God and it's absolute. And it's like, here's 2,000 words of you're wrong when you want to go and make this particular claim about Muslims. And this is of fundamental importance because actually the way that fundamentalism has come to be explained in the Western context is when people think that the Bible is the direct word of God. And then they transfer that definition onto Islam. And as we know, this is part of a standard creed in any school of Islam, that the Quran is the word of God. But it's actually the exact opposite for us. That it's when you start to think that the human interpretation of it is absolute, or a particular interpretation of it is absolute, that then you start declining into strident puritanical, or what people call fundamentalist views of the text. Because the fact that we view the Quran as the absolute infinite word of God is what leads to there being multiple interpretations. That, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that the scholars would never tire of the Quran and never be satiated by the Quran, because it is infinite and there is no human understanding of the Quran, of any ayah, that can fully encompass it. Because we are finite beings and we cannot fully encompass and fully understand the infinite. And this is actually, in a sense, what prevents, you might say, more strident puritanical and more ideological manifestations and hardline manifestations within our tradition. And so we think that this is something that really comes across. If one goes, for example, to verse 262, the famous verse which says, verily those who believe, the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, they are those who believe in God and perform good deeds. They shall have the reward with their Lord. They shall not fear, nor shall they suffer. There are multiple interpretations. We actually have 2 full pages that give you different ways in which this particular verse has been understood by different scholars over time. When it comes to the issue of qadr, I tried to actually outline almost the entire debate among different schools over time. And for those of you who don't know, qadr literally means God's measuring out. And so it becomes the word around which the debate regarding free will and predestination plays out within the Islamic tradition. So we've tried to give one a kind of a full access to some of these things within the tradition. Not fully, within 2,000 pages you can't do the whole thing, obviously. But we've tried to do it to the best of our humble ability. Now, the next aspect of the study Quran is essays that are at the end. There are 15 essays that cover things such as tafsir. And by the way, I tell everybody that to understand the study Quran and how to understand it, they should read the article on tafsir in the study Quran. Because one of the things is we have a tendency to think of tafsir often as being a kind of, pure scholarly endeavor. But oftentimes tafsirs are written in response to other tafsirs. They sometimes do have political dimensions within them of certain kinds. And so it's good to understand how they relate to one another over time. That's why Walid Saleh, who I consider to be probably one of the top 3 scholars of tafsir in the Western Academy. We also have an article by Ingrid Matson on how to read the Quran. And I've actually heard some Muslims who've even said, that was a very helpful essay for me. And then there's also an article by William Chittick on Sufism in the Quran. There's an article by Ayatollah Muhaqqiq al-Damad, who is a leading Shiite scholar on philosophy and theology in the Quran. There's an article by Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Sheikh al-Azhar, on, who is now Sheikh al-Azhar. He wasn't Sheikh al-Azhar when he wrote the article on Islamic law and the Quran. And then one on the Quran and jihad and violence. And I actually think that the 2 best essays to my mind are the one by Ingrid Matson on how to read the Quran, and also the one by Hamza Yusuf on death, dying, and the afterlife in the Quran, which of course had to be the last of the essays. And so this is how the volume is, in a sense, put together. And you see with the essays, we tried to get a broad swath where we represent both people who are trained within the Western Academy and people who are identified with a more, shall we say, traditional, classical madrasa type of education. So we could represent that broad spectrum. And now you have the volume before you after 9 years of going through this. It is a volume that is not perfect. It can't be perfect. I don't think that any human endeavor can really ever be fully perfect, and especially if you are to put it next to the Word of God itself. It pales in comparison. But one of the things that I think that I hope that it will achieve, and this is a question that I have been asked, is what is it that you're achieving with this text? I mean, one of the things I spoke at Zaytuna the night before last, and one of the questions is, well, are you taking, in a sense, authority away from the traditional ulama by having a group of Western-trained scholars work on this text? And I don't think so at all. But I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that that authority has actually been being taken away for over 150 years within the tradition. We have people who are university professors, both within the West and within the Islamic world, who are writing about the Quran, who are writing about the classical tradition, who are contributing in ways that are reshaping it. And these are people writing from Iran to Morocco to Indonesia in different ways. And so that is a shift that has already happened to some degree. But more importantly, now one thing is, for myself, I'm not claiming authority as a traditional scholar in any way. It's in a sense to present aspects of this and how certain verses can be reflected upon. But I think what is more important is in the context of scholarship on the Quran that you have, particularly in the Western context, we hope to reshift some of the authority to the traditional sources themselves. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Western academic tradition, you will often come across what I call almost throwaway lines regarding the classical Islamic tradition that will say, well, you can't rely on those sources. Why? Why can't you rely on them? Anybody know?
Because they were written by Muslims.
Exactly. How could you rely on Muslims to tell you about Islam? What a silly thing. All right? That's racism. I'm sorry, it is. It's just flat out racist. But it's something that is basically the Western academic tradition has attempted to set up another way of looking at the Quran. There's a very interesting article written by Bruce Fudge, who's a Western academic, that basically saying that Western academics have to realize and admit that they're basically in the process of kind of setting up their own mode of tafsir. All right? Well, if you're going to do that, you should be in dialogue with 1,300 years of tafsir. No scholar worth his training is going to go out there and start writing about a topic and not get the other materials that have been written about that topic that she or he is covering. And yet somehow there's this idea that the Western tradition could have just picked up the Quranic text and then started developing ways of looking at it that don't take into account what has been said within the classical Islamic tradition. And this becomes very important, especially as I alluded to before, when it comes to the question of the history of the Quranic text. When you go through the tafsir tradition, many scholars were deeply interested in the history of the text qua history. That is just the history as history. Like, okay, we accept that it's the Word of God, but given that, how did this verse come about? When did this come about? What is the historical context of this surah? Did this surah come before that surah? Were these verses from the Meccan period or from the Medinan period? What are the implications if this report that it's from the Medinan period is accurate, but this report that it's from the Meccan period is accurate? And they would unfold these particular implications within this. This is really a way of looking at it in a historical critical sense. So if you're going to have a historical critical approach in the modern sense, you at least need to take account of what was said. And many things that are deep within that tradition, for example, philology. What does a word mean? I mean, a word like samad, you have 19 different ideas in Tabari alone of what the word samad means. A word like hanif, there's a lot of discussion of exactly what hanif means within the classical tradition. But what ended up happening in the Western tradition is there ended up being an attitude, well, because there's this debate regarding these words, these people actually didn't understand what it meant. There's actually a scholar who wrote that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he didn't understand the words that he was saying. I mean, this is actually an idea that gained wide circulation within the Western Academy. And so you have to, in a sense, bring out all of these discussions that were had. And this, by the way, this is a phenomenon referred to as the etymological fallacy. Walid Saleh has an excellent article about this. Where you try to say, no, it's Syriac, no, it's Hebrew, no, it's this, no, it comes from that, no, it comes from Ethiopic, no, it's a Persian origin. And you end up with all of these mutually contradictory theories, which just linguistically, they're actually ridiculous because, it's like saying, well, when you say, when you say the word, I don't know, when Americans speak about pants, excuse me for this illusion, but when Americans speak about pants, they're actually speaking about underpants, but they don't know it. Because in Great Britain, the pants means underpants, and that's where people first started talking about this. And so it's like you say, I met with Joe and he was wearing nice pants. And then you say from that, well, Joe's walking around without anything covering his bottom. I mean, this would be, but this is the type of kind of etymological reasoning that you would have coming out of this. And it's like, once a word assumes a meaning within a particular linguistic context, and even linguists will say this, you treat it as part of that context. And this is something that by resituating these discussions within the classical tradition, you can see how this is used. And so it's more important how the Bedouins used a word than whether or not that word is related to a word in Syriac or Hebrew or had a Greek origin or something along these lines. And so we think that by doing this, it's a way to help reshift the authority for the study of the Quran within the Western academic tradition to the classical sources. It doesn't mean that everything that they say is true, and I'll tell you there's stuff that we found in there that well, this really isn't something that we've since in a sense found out, that this particular interpretation of such and such a scholar really doesn't attain. I mean, even though people said there were opinions of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, that the Fatiha wasn't part of the Quran and that the last two surahs weren't part of the Quran. It's an opinion that people say, well, now it's wrong. There are other things in tafsir that have been handed down. We say, well, no, so that's an opinion, but it's not correct. And this is the way that you work as academics. And so the Western academic tradition has to grapple with this. And we hope that by bringing this out in the study Quran, it will be something that resituates that authority for the study of the Quran within the classical tradition. It doesn't mean that other methodologies can't be applied, but it means that they have to at least be conversant with the classical tradition. And this could do a lot to change the manner in which the Quran is understood both within the Western Academy and more broadly within the West. All right, now I'll open it up to some of your questions.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.